welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. A lot going on in the region and in Israel these days, and I want to start with the biggest regional development in recent days, which is the conclusion in Beijing on Friday of a normalization agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia under the aegis of the People's Republic of China. Iran and Saudi Arabia have agreed to restore their diplomatic relations for the first time since 2016. And this is a big deal. This is a big deal first and foremost for the United States, because what it shows more than anything else is that spurned U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia are looking for and finding other options for superpower allies, in this case, America's chief rival, China. This is a big blow to America's position in the region and a big upgrade for China. That they're doing this. They're already the largest, I think, purchaser of oil certainly from Iran and increasingly from Saudi Arabia. They're using their soft power, their AI technologies and their 5G technologies, which they're industrializing, to bring more and more countries in the Middle East and throughout the world into the Belt and Road Initiative and into China's economic zone. In competition, of course, with the U.S. zone. We've already seen the purchase of oil in yuan and in rubles, which is essentially canceling the petrodollar. The U.S. dollar as the currency for global oil markets is now no longer the king. And this is a big deal, and you would expect for the United States to be really upset about this, but they're not, at least not officially. And by all counts, not at all. The administration and their proxies have all said that they're totally fine with this. They think it's fantastic. Really, the only thing that they care about is the outcome, and they were supportive of a restoration of ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran all along, and they have no problem with the fact that this was mediated by the Chinese. And I think what's notable about this is that I actually believe the Americans. The Biden administration really doesn't care about the rise of China, not at the expense of the United States and not at all. If they did, they would be taking a whole host of actions, which they're not taking both at home and abroad, to try to ward off and surmount the rising challenge that China poses for the United States, both economically and strategically. I mean, for instance, just, off the top of my head, rather than fight Chinese subversion of Americans through academia, through their various initiatives on college campuses, something that the Trump administration worked to shut down, the Biden administration has opened it up. They've closed investigations against U.S. academics that received money and grants from the Department of Defense and also received money and grants from China and didn't report on the money that they were receiving from China. These are steps that you wouldn't take if you were trying to compete with China or tamp down on Chinese power and influence. You would be doing the kinds of things that my colleague and friend David Goldman has been calling for, screaming about for the past decade, which is putting major investments, $1 trillion, not in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, but in rebuilding and expanding U.S. technological capabilities along the lines of the Strategic Defense Initiative that the Reagan administration carried out in 1983 to defeat the Soviet Union. The United States would be investing that kind of money in research and development of U.S. technologies. Just last week, I think it was, the Wall Street Journal put out a study. They published a study that showed that China is now outpacing the United States, I think in 37 out of 41 technologies and scientific areas, so that the Chinese are now surpassing the United States in science and technology, something that U.S. elites have for generations poo-pooed the possibility of happening. And yet it is happening. It's happening now right in front of our eyes. In the United States, rather than fight this, they're acting like it's no big deal. Again, you wouldn't think that the Americans would act the way that they are, but manufacturing, is the Biden administration doing anything to restore American manufacturing? No, nothing. Are they doing anything like the Trump administration did to enable American energy independence? To the contrary, they're doing everything that they can to block American energy independence, whether it's with natural gas pipelines that they've shut down, or fracking licenses that they're not giving on federal lands, and everything in between. So they're encouraging U.S. energy producers not to produce. They're not encouraging U.S. companies to remove themselves back to the United States from abroad. Nothing. They're not doing anything that you would expect them to do, and so it's not surprising that here, too, the United States is not fighting in any way Chinese encroachment in the Middle East. And then Iran. I mean, this is an agreement that absolutely empowers Iran. Excuse me, I got a bit of a cold this week. Iran wins from this, right? I mean, they've been wanting to be restored to the fold in the Middle East with the Arab states. And here, through the good offices of the Chinese, they are. This is a big bonanza for Iran, and the United States doesn't mind. Why doesn't it mind? I mean, just last week or 10 days ago, the director of the CIA, William Burns, said that Iran is just 12 days away from nuclear breakout, whatever that means, how you cannot be at nuclear breakdown if you're 12 days away, and how the CIA knows how to say precisely 12 days and not 13 or 11. Beyond me, but, you know, I'm not a CIA officer, so maybe I don't have that enlightenment required to understand what that means, 12 days away from nuclear breakout. At any rate, you would think that the United States would be doing everything that they could to try to push the Iranian nuclear genie back in the bottle, since they claim that they're so opposed to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. But they're not doing anything of the sort. To the contrary, we see that interest, very clear, keen interest that the British and the EU have expressed in applying economic sanctions to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, to designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization. The United States, the Biden administration, is actually actively working to undermine their efforts to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. So the United States is standing by happily, watching, doing nothing as Iran gets more empowered, as it is brought back into the fold of the Middle East, as it expands its strategic alliance with China, with Russia, as it supplies the weapons of war to Russia to maintain its war of attrition against Ukraine, while the United States is not capable today industrially to replenish the stores that it's emptying out by supplying Ukraine in this war. So, you know, the United States is not acting like a superpower that's concerned about either maintaining its position, protecting its allies, preventing its enemies from increasing their power, whether that enemy is the People's Republic of China or the Islamic Republic of Iran. So where does that leave us, right? I mean, it leaves Israel in a perfect storm. Last week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went to Rome. This week, he's supposed to be going to Berlin to lobby European leaders to do what they want to do, which is to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization, among other things, and to end the nuclear diplomacy that they continue to carry out through the EU and that Rob Malley is carrying out through the Iraqi regime and others to try to empower Iran still further through the cancellation of sanctions, even as Iran strides towards the nuclear finish line. So Netanyahu, we've seen that he's trying to fight this diplomatically through his shuttle diplomacy to Europe. He's trying to fight this diplomatically with soft power. Last week, he gave an interview to Iran International. That's the television network that broadcasts into Iran in Farsi. That was forced to leave London, where they were headquartered until just a couple of weeks ago, and moved to Washington at a moment's notice because they were under critical threat from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which Britain, again, wants to designate as a terrorist organization. But the U.S., despite the fact that the IRGC is operating in the United States to kill former U.S. officials like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and even former President Trump, the Biden administration is pushing the Europeans not to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization and impose the sanctions related to such a designation by Europe. So Netanyahu is going to the Iranian people, speaking to them directly in a very important interview that was broadcast into Iran last Thursday night. So he's talking to the Europeans, he's talking to the Iranian people, and He's giving the IDF and Israel's security apparatuses the means, financial and material, they need in order to carry out a military strike against Iran's nuclear installations to, again, push Iran back, to push them back, to prevent them from crossing the nuclear threshold, from becoming a nuclear power. Netanyahu told the interviewer in Iran International, and he said on many occasions that he's only returned to office. He only decided to return to office to take care of the Iranian nuclear threat, and he's absolutely committed to doing that, and I think we can trust him. I know we can trust him on this score. But all of this is happening at a terrible time inside in Israel. I don't think that there's anything here that's just happening by chance. I think we've spoken here on this program and at JNS about the fact that the United States is funding through the State Department one of the central nodes of the revolutionary violence that we're seeing on the part of the left against the government, the Netanyahu government, and against the coalition and against the Knesset. The Movement for Quality Government has been receiving direct support from the U.S. State Department. Every single senior member of the administration, from Biden and Kamala Harris to Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, last week it was Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, have all essentially sided with the rioters on the streets of Israel against the Netanyahu government. Saying that the Netanyahu government shouldn't. It's anti-democratic for the democratically elected government of Israel to pass in a lawful way measures in parliament that realign the balance of power by placing minimal limitations on judicial power in Israel. The ambassador here, Tom Nides, has broken every diplomatic convention, essentially, by openly interfering in Israel's domestic affairs, treating the Netanyahu, relating to him as a child, saying, I speak to the Israeli government as I speak to my children, he said in a podcast with David Axelrod, and say, you have to pump on the brakes on this judicial reform, you mustn't pass it. And meeting very openly with leaders of the riots outside in Tel Aviv and throughout the country, acting not as the opposition to the government, but as the resistance, as if the government is an illegal, unlawful, illegitimate occupying power of their country. So the United States is very clearly supporting this. Somebody on the outside, on the inside, in Israel, outside of Israel. We know a lot of outside groups, both in the EU and the American Jewish community through the New Israel Fund, are funding this. They say so openly. And this is not simply a demonstration. This isn't a mass rally of people who are getting up. They're being pushed up. Somebody's directing this. This costs hundreds of millions of dollars. This isn't a joke. This is a huge production. I mean, just every flag that they bring out into their rallies that they're bringing in on rented trains, on rented trucks to Tel Aviv to hand out, each one of those flags costs at least $10. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of flags that they're buying and distributing at every rally. So, I mean, just that alone is an outlay that, no Likud rally has ever seen. Somebody's paying for this. Somebody is directing it. I don't know who, but there are a lot of people involved, and they're not all in Israel, and I'm not even sure most of them are in Israel. But this is an attack on the Jewish state from inside. And this brings me to, what we talked about last week, which was the pilots from a key, perhaps the most operational squadron in the Israel Air Force, saying that they want to that they're not going to serve in reserves. They're not going to serve in reserves at a time when, as I laid out, the clock is ticking down on Iran, and Israel's going to have to operate now in the next 2 months. I mean, the Saudi-Iranian deal, the one out for Israel is that it only goes into effect in 2 months, so we have 8 weeks to act. Because once we let those 2 months pass without acting, Saudi Arabia may be unreachable. So we don't have a lot of time to act. And in the meantime, somebody is fomenting internal dissent and effectively trying to incite a civil war here. And how do we see this playing out? But I want to just spend the last couple of minutes of this opening to talk about, what to do in this situation. How do you pull people back from the brink? How do you get pilots, who are Zionist, but are in a state of panic and hysteria and fear, to walk away from the edge and to come back and to rejoin Israeli society and the people who are protecting this country? Again, and this is a perfect storm at a town where we are about, 8 hour plus 8 weeks, right, of taking care of Iran's nuclear installations and blocking Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons wielding state. And I think the answer is even though they won't come and they won't speak to the right, I think it's very important that we pass very quickly the judicial reform based on some of the compromise proposals that have been put forward by Professor Yuval Bashan, Giora Island, former Justice Minister Daniel Friedman, to use that as a basis for the laws that are going to be passed by the Knesset. And I think that, and making clear, and that they should be making clear that this is not a usurpation of power. This is not a regime change, except in the sense that you're abrogating an oligarchy and you're reinforcing Israel democratic norms across the 3 branches of government in Israel. And past that, we can revisit this later. But then I really believe, and I've been saying this to colleagues and friends, and I think it's time for me to say it here. I mean, I think what we're missing is a speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he speaks to the people of Israel and anybody else who wants to listen. And he brings us together by reminding us of what Zionism is and how all of us have played a role in building this country and how sacred it is to everybody across the political spectrum and the sociological spectrum. And why it is that this judicial reform came about. It came about because the judiciary has seized the powers of the representatives of this people, and it has hurt community after community in this country through its usurpation of power. It's hurt the denizens of South Tel Aviv, the working class neighborhoods of Tel Aviv that have been overwhelmed by violent criminal, often illegal aliens from Africa who have trespassed our border and transformed their communities into urban crime zones, and the Supreme Court has sided with them against the citizens of Israel. It has trounced the rights of the disabled. It has trounced the rights of the Ethiopian community. It has trounced the rights of the ultra-Orthodox, of the religious Zionists. It has trounced the rights of Arab Israelis. All of these different groups have been harmed. It has trounced the rights of Israeli businesses by seizing the power to interpret contracts, making Israel ranked below South Sudan and Saudi Arabia in terms of the security that people can have when they sign deals with Israeli companies, that their contracts are going to be respected by the courts in Israel. They have undermined our ability to develop our national resources. We were one vote away from the Supreme Court blocking Israel from developing our natural gas deposits in the East Mediterranean. All of these things are actions that the Supreme Court has taken because there haven't been any limits placed on their power. And Netanyahu has to give a speech and explain why this has become necessary and explain what it does. And then he has to rally the people together again, based on our common Zionist heritage, our Jewish heritage, and our belief and attachment to this country. And he has to rally us for what lays ahead. Lays ahead not in the distant future, but now, which is our need to contend with in a military fashion through military means, Iran's efforts to become a nuclear power. And, there are 99 ways to skin a cat, and there are 99 ways to achieve this aim. But we have to use all 99 of them now in the coming weeks, because otherwise we're going to face all of this, and it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse inside, and it's going to get worse outside. As a riven people, we're not going to have the ability to contend with this. So I think time is of the essence. We are indeed all brothers. We're angry at each other, but that doesn't mean that we're not part of the same people and family, and that we have both a common past, a common present, and a common future. And that's the job of the Prime Minister, to stand up and explain this to the Israeli people. I think we have to, again, pass a compromise, bring in as many people as we can, and then the Prime Minister has to speak to the Israeli people about why this is important and why we're doing it together. So those are my thoughts, and now let's talk a little bit about the psychosis of the left and what it is that stands at the root of everything that we're facing today, with my friend and colleague, Amnon Lord. As we've been discussing now for weeks, the left in Israel is basically, I don't even know whether we can discuss what's happening today on a political level or whether we have to go into a psychological level. But I think that the issue of the left in Israel, what's happening to it, how it views its relationship to the rest of Israeli society is really one of the key issues of our time. And I want to talk about this with the person who I think understands the left better than most in Israel, perhaps better than any of my very close friends. So I asked my friend Amnon Lord from Israel Hayom to join me today to discuss the situation of the Israeli left in Israel, which is calling for civil war. It's calling for people to take their money out of Israel. It's calling for soldiers not to obey orders, for policemen not to obey orders. It's calling for, it's in a state of general revolt. So I asked my friend Amnon Lord from Israel Hayom to join me today. I think this is a repeat performance for him or appearance for you on the Caroline Glick Show. Thanks so much for joining me today, Amnon.
Thank you for having me, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be here and to try again my old tricks.
Your old tricks in English. Well, like I said, we have...
in analyzing the left.
In analyzing the left. Yeah, well, it maybe you have to resort to trickery because the left is acting in a way that is so subversive. And we have everybody from Ehud Barak to the Attorney General to all sorts of people undermining the government, saying it's not legitimate, acting as though it's not legitimate, calling for former presidents of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak and Dorit Beinish and others, essentially calling for a civil war. And the media is involved with this in a very serious way, leading the efforts to almost brainwash the public into thinking that they're facing the most dangerous. How do you explain? What do you look at it, first of all? How do you see it?
First of all, they broke the civil discourse. It's very rare. There are some people that I managed to have civil discussion with them about the problems, even among the other side, among the leftists, because some of them do agree that the power should return to the people, to the Knesset, from the power grab that the Supreme Court did. But still, they are torn within themselves. They belong to the other camp, to the camp of, because the other side is, those who so-called protest, but in a way they're in a frenzy of political warfare against their brethren, against the legal government. They are torn. They are part of the camp that they are leftists, but some of them do agree at the same time that what Yariv Levin tries to do is correct, to take some of the Supreme Court power and get it back to the Knesset.
See, one of the things that I found really disturbing over the past couple of weeks was the second speech that President Herzog gave. In the first speech that he gave several weeks ago, the most important contribution that he made wasn't his specific offer for how to reform the judiciary, which I didn't like, and I didn't think it was realistic for a number of reasons. But he did two things, President Herzog, in his first speech that were extremely important. The first one was that he recognized the legitimacy of the elected government and that there are election results. And the second thing is that we have this oligarchical judiciary that chooses its own members, that isn't limited in any way. The scope of its powers, all they do is seize more and more powers, and there are no limits on it. And he recognized that there have to be limits on it. So those were two very important things. But last week, he gave a very angry speech where he demanded that the Knesset stop the legislative process for judicial reform. And it was very surprising to me, and I didn't understand where it was coming from. And I want to know how you explain it. And I also want to understand another thing, which one of the most remarkable things that I've found about the left in this current iteration of sort of a meltdown on its part is that there's no disagreement in the ranks. You know, in the right, you have everybody from secular to ultra-Orthodox, from socialist to, ultra free market capitalism, libertarian, social conservative. You have everything, and everybody argues with one another. And on the left, it doesn't seem, it's the uniformity here is
First
stunning.
of all, I think that Herzog was overwhelmed and shaken by the events of that day. They used the same terminology as the Palestinians, a day of rage,
Resistance.
day of resistance, as though they're acting like an army behind the lines, behind enemy lines. Now, he belongs to a certain kind of social milieu, social roots. He was... In a way, he returned to become the president of the left. He was head of the labor. He was first assistant or secretary of the government of Ehud Barak. He was very close to Barak. They were even, they stole horses together in the elections of 1999.
Traded, yeah.
So I think he's still under the Barak influence in some ways, and Barak is the true leader of this entire operation. Does he think that he can? He managed to galvanize the entire spectrum of people in Israel who do not belong to the Likud and the right-wing coalition. And this group in Israel is composed by, on various dimensions. The first dimension is social and historical. They claim that they built this country, it belongs to them, and now that you took it over, you means the deplorables plus people of color, people who came from the Arab lands, people who came from Machanot, from the camps. We let you play with democracy for a few years. Now that you have taken over, we're not going to let you rule. We're going to break the entire connections between the wheel,
And
the steering wheel and the wheels of the car. And this is our land. We own it. We established the state. We were the heroic pilots in various points during the history of the country. That's one dimension. The other dimension is the old leftist and socialist tradition. In the early 50s, Israel also was on the verge of civil war. because the extremely left, who was also extremely Stalinist, there was, like today, a crack up along the line of, is Israel going to the West, to America, or is it going to go to Stalin, to the Soviet Union? And on that issue, the entire kibbutz movement, the crown of Zionism, was split. Kibbutzim split between them. Families split. People couldn't talk to each other. Daughters, there are various testimonies of old people, teachers who looked at the eyes of their daughters, their literal daughters, and they saw them like, they thought they were like those children who were kidnapped to the Tsar's army. That's the, Ben-Gurion called it Shmad Russi, Shmad.
That they
Russian,
were annihilated, Russian
Shmad,
annihilation.
no, not annihilation, Shmad, but in the Jewish context.
Yeah, that they were destroying Judaism.
Shmad, not extermination. Shmad is, you know, when you lose your Jewishness to your Yevsektia. Do you know?
Yeah,
it's a Russian term. You know,
it's the Jewish section of
that's
the
the term
of the
he used.
NKVD that they used to annihilate Jewish life in the Soviet Union.
He called not physical annihilation,
No,
spiritual
annihilation.
Yes, he called certain schools as schools of Yevsektia. That's in the early 50s. But it wasn't this kind of movement, but still, you know, it's ironic. The Histadrut, the trade unions, the labor union federations is not joining forces with this movement of crazies on the roads, because most of what left from the proletariat, from the working class in Israel, are right-wing.
Right.
And they also know that if they break the Israeli economy, they will have no means for living. So as long as the Histadrut, this government of free market can trust the Histadrut more than they can trust the police. Can you imagine?
And the army.
And the army. No, I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so. The fact
but here,
that
let me give you two things that stood out to me this past week, okay? The first thing that stood out to me, and I'm talking about in the last 3 days, all right, is we're taping this on Sunday, is that on Saturday night, Kobi Shabtai, the Inspector General of the police, he gets up, he gives this primetime press conference. On Friday, he and Public Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir decided that they were going to remove the head of the Tel Aviv command of the police from his duty because he's completely failed to deal with anything. And this was Thursday, actually. And then on Thursday night, the Attorney General, Gali Barav Miara, who was appointed by Gideon Sa'ar, who is one of the most active members of the resistance, she, without any basis in law, intervened on behalf of the...
She's the law. She's not a servant of the law.
Right, but she's not the law, because the law says that the...
Of course not, but this is how it works in Israel.
According to Israeli law, the public security minister can remove a policeman or officer from his position at any time. So they agreed, the Inspector General of Police and the police minister, to remove the Tel Aviv district commander from his position, give him another job in charge of training. And she objected, right?
Yeah.
And she objected. And then on Saturday night, the Inspector General of Police gave this press conference where he looked like a deer caught in somebody's headlights. And he gave this almost incomprehensible statement where he was still moving, but it was going to be after Ramadan, and he made a mistake, and and then talk about how horrible he feels about coming down hard on the rioters who are blocking traffic at major highway junctions in Israel. And it was a very, I mean, it was cowardly, but it was also terrifying to watch this. And then on the other hand, you had in the army, you had what I was talking about with Brigadier General Amir Avivi last week's show about the pilots who said that they weren't going to serve. And then they kind of walked that back. And then the commander of the Air Force, I think also on Thursday, relieved the ringleader of those pilots who said they were going to stop flying from his duties. And then, like, he reversed course the next day.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, you see that they try to stand up to them, and then both the chief of staff of the IDF and the inspector general of the police crumpled.
That's first of all, it's very worrying, you know, that in Israel today, the government does not, it does not quite command or have full control of the armed forces, the IDF, the police, Shabak.
And Mossad.
They you cannot, this is what's terrifying the citizens. Can they trust the armed forces? This is why people live in such anxiety. In Israel today, there is anxiety. You agree with me,
Oh,
right?
yes, very much so.
They managed to drive it to the consciousness of the citizens. Now, that goes together with the other dimension of this gathering of forces. It's not only social and historical or ideological history of the left. It's also the Israeli ruling class, the elites joining together in a way to harm the economy. And what they didn't manage to harm the economy so far. That's interesting. But they do manage to harm security, internal security in Israel. There's no doubt about it. We don't know anymore. Well, I trust the IDF. Most of the units, of the ground units, are loyal, are simple people. But you can see now, and it's very sad to watch, who would have believed that the IDF, the army of the people, would become a class military? You understand? You see what I mean? There are classes here. There are the Givati fighter in Hebron who was thrown to jail because of something that he said, and this colonel in the Air Force who should have spent the next 20 years in jail, and instead he's back in the same position that he was before, and he's doing a double job. He's both a commander in the Air Force, in the Miluim, in the reserve. At the same time, he's one of the leaders of the riots against the government, against the legal government that should control as a civilian or as a political echelon over the military.
So you talk about the ruling class, and I mean, that's really, so much of this, right? Is that, they pretend that this is a popular movement, but really all of the people in the streets are rallying on behalf of the most powerful forces in Israeli society.
Ex-military generals, ex-commanders in the police,
and Mossad,
high-tech chieftains,
moguls,
high-tech moguls, ex-judiciary people, you name it, the entire, and especially the media. The media is, it's like Lenin in his, the simple instructions for how to handle a revolution. You have to control the broadcasting station or the telegraph. Genghis Khan with the telegraph station. But this one thing that the Israeli ruling class don't have to make any effort. It already entrenched in the Israeli media for generations, forever. And you don't have, you can have quite a few right-wing reporters and in the media, but you need only a few, those with that gets airtime, that spells what's going on, that they follow with their cameras hours on end of the riots. So they're definitely part of it. If they didn't collaborate with the rioters, it would quiet down. But I think still, since they lost the collaboration of the Histadrut, I think they will try to go as far as they can to create some kind of explosion, but they won't be able to paralyze the Israeli economy. And in time of emergency, the moving parts will coalesce together, and I won't say everything will be okay. I do believe it will.
But the thing is that, we were talking about before we started recording, and this is really just so apparent to people who live here, but it's not to people outside, which is that...
Because Jews in the States don't like to hear those things in the past. They didn't like to hear it because it doesn't paint a nice picture of the Israeli society.
I was talking to somebody who will remain nameless, but somebody who is extremely pro-Israel in the United States. And he said to me, look, I don't really want to hear about it. And I don't want to know about it. And evangelicals love Israel because you're God's chosen people, and Israel is the embodiment or proof that God keeps his word. And this story doesn't gel with the way that people think of Israel as a symbol, and what you're showing us with this is that you're human beings, and in a way it's like it's against the anti-Semites and the philo-Semites that we're actually acting like human beings. But I think part of this also is that what's happening in Israel is happening in America. It's almost like they're following the Trump resistance playbook to a T, right? Trump was elected, and instead of being an opposition, which is what you always had, right? If the Democrats are in power, then the Republicans are the opposition, and vice versa. But Trump gets in, and on his inauguration day, they began their resistance. And it was a resistance, and it was that the United States had been occupied, right, by a hostile, illegitimate force, and therefore doing things that in older times, when things were clearer, would have been considered treasonous, was suddenly a mark of valor. And you're getting that here as well. So that what we're experiencing here is something that's much bigger than Israel. But in Israel's case, because we face so many external threats, it's exceedingly dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's happening in Israel, it's a bit like the other way, what happened in Brazil after Bolsonaro lost. There was a storming of the parliament. So we don't have really a storming in the parliament, but we have something similar, only from the left. And I think that today, in our days, in some ways, it's a fascistic movement that but on the left lane. If you want to be a modern fascist, you have to cry democracy and drive in the left lane. If you drive in the right lane, you will tackle various obstacles. So choose your what you want. I think the fact that they all think, I experience it personally. People that I know from the other side, because my past is my past. I have friends from the kibbutz, from the left. they pressure me personally, almost beg me to save the day, to come out against Bibi. Stay where you are, but at least here, say, write in your column that everything should freeze, something like this. It's quite a psychological pressure. Some of the people I noticed that people from old friendships, people who think completely the opposite from me, ex-kibbutzniks or people from the kibbutzim, they remain loyal friends. They think different from me. They ask me to return to לחזור בתשובה, but it's completely different. They keep being friendly. Other people, who were friends, hurt me, really stabbed me in the most hurtful way.
Now? You mean right now? What's going on now?
Yeah.
It's hard to understand how politics can become such a powerful psychological force that it really, there is something very totalitarian about it.
It's totalitarian, and it's also on a level, on an atavistic tribal level. I'll give you an example from today. It's not political, but it's social. Just today I met a woman who incidentally was born in the same kibbutz that I was born. She left with her parents already before I was born, but it was enough for us to bond together, to feel some kind
kinship.
Of kinship, very close kinship, just because she was born with the group that established the kibbutz, and I remembered her father. It's hard to explain. It's like finding a relative, and now I'm sure she thinks completely different from me. So on that level, you can understand the bondage that they have together, the nucleus of this group. This is why some writers say, and they write unashamedly, this is ours, we're not, it's like their old plantation. You will not enter here.
Years ago, over 20 years ago, I interviewed Major General in the Army, Uri Sagi, who was the head of intelligence director, about Oslo. And he compared the religious Zionists in Israel to a faulty product on a product line. And he said, we are the Mayflower generation. And it was a very strange statement because it's like no American you can practically think of would want to say that.
It's so undemocratic and shameful.
But they're shameless. Like they don't. I saw a video last night that was posted sometime over Shabbat. I don't even remember who it was who gave it, but this guy who was one of the heads of the resistance, he gives this whole sociological explanation of the resistance, and he says this is a fight about the Jewish story. So he started, this first story was a story of the Bible. The second story was a story of the, in Jerusalem and the temple and the rituals of the temple. And then after the destruction of the second temple, we became a diaspora people, and it was the story of the Talmud and the oral tradition. And then Zionism is the third Jewish narrative. And Zionism means that we're supposed to be a liberal democracy, albeit Jewish, but not too Jewish. And now these people, and he specifically was talking about the religious Zionists, who aren't even the majority of the people in the government, and they're not leading it, but whatever. they want to change it completely. They want to turn Israel into a halachic state. Then they want to rebuild the temple or whatever. And the weirdest thing about what he said is that his rendition of the Zionist tale was wrong. I mean, he was saying that the Zionist revolution and the Jewish people and the establishment of Israel had nothing to do with Judaism or Messianism or anything else. I mean, as our friend Gershon Cohen always says, he quotes chapter and verse of Ben Gurion. It's quite messianic and very Jewish. And you look at, and they say that the Declaration of Independence is the document, but there's nothing in the Declaration of Independence doesn't give any basis for anything that they're saying.
Of course not. I think, let's say, it's not only against the Jewishness of the state, but, Justice Yitzhak Zamir, a few decades ago, the problem of sarbanut, how you call it?
Of refusing orders.
Refusing orders to go to Lebanon or the occupied territories. It started in full volume like in 1982 with Yesh Gvul. But later on, he said, Justice Zamir said completely in a discussion with some of the people who were pro-sarbanut, that this is one kind of threat, one kind of danger that people should not place on the Jewish state. We have various threats, not only on the Jewish state, and democracy. He stressed that in 1990, it's in a book called Gvulot HaTziyut or something. It was published by
of
obedience, and he stated
or the limits of obedience.
This is the kind of danger that no one should place on Israel and the Israeli society and the Israeli democracy. You shouldn't do it. You endanger. It's an existential danger of the state. And now it's like being played out in such a careless way. It's this kind of carelessness is really something that I don't have really a real explanation. Why ex-generals in the military or Prime Minister Olmert or Ron Huldai, who is the mayor of Tel Aviv, or Ehud Barak, why are they willing to incite such sedition and incite, miluimnikim, reservists, not to obey orders? It's something that's beyond belief for Israel in our condition, under a terrorist attack and with the threat of Iran, to do it. Is it suicidal? What is it?
Well, what do you think? I mean, it does, as I said at the outset of our conversation, this is more psychological than anything else. How do you...
It's not just psychological. I think if we go all the way and you make the Israeli state collapse, from this chaos, you can steer things in the farthest direction, even including uprooting maybe 2,000 settlers from Judea and Samaria.
2,000?
200,000. A few hundred thousands. I think if there is an emergency government coming out of this mess, there could be some kind of... they really dream because they don't see any way to get back to government, to rule. They understand that they cannot win elections. They do have a chance to do it, but they don't believe it. They think there is a demographic determination against them, and they will not be able to win any election in the future. And they think that the only way to steer things their own way is doing it by force.
So, I mean, Tamir Pardo, the former director of the Mossad, said it fairly clearly in an interview that he gave, I think, on Thursday night to Ilana Dayan on the Pravda-like show Truth on Channel 12. And he said that this is much bigger than judicial reform. If we succeed in blocking the government's plans to place limits on judicial authority, we're not going to end with that. We also, there are also issues of the Judaism in the state, and also regarding the Palestinians that we want. And we see all
there
of
you
the
go.
PLO flags.
There you go. You have a few targets. Judaizing of Israel, uprooting the settlers, and creating a Palestinian state. If everything goes chaotic, this would be the end game. I don't believe they will get there. I don't see it, it's not such a great end game to reach. But this, when you mentioned the Pardo, right? I think this brings us back to the social issues. There are a couple of security institutions which carries with them the social fabric from the old times. Like, he came from Sayeret Matkal, right? Sayeret Matkal...
That's the IDF's General Staff Commando Unit. That's what Yoni Netanyahu commanded.
It's the
That's
elite,
what Benjamin Netanyahu was
the
in.
The elite unit. And there was this series in Channel 13 about the history of their operations. It's a kind of unit that was created with the thought of preserving the spirit of the Palmach. Palmach was, you could call it the Red Brigade. When it was dismantled by Ben-Gurion in 1948, some of the leaders of Mapam, who was the Stalinist party, which was a very strong party, one of them, Yaakov Chazan, said, if there will be a prime minister named Begin, he called him Begin, the Palmach will not obey orders, and I will not see it as a negative thing. Symbolically, you can say the Palmach is resurrected now, and it will not obey orders. Now, the one who established Sayeret Matkal, his name was Avraham Arnan. He was a soldier in the 4th battalion of the Palmach. It was a very unique battalion under the command of Yosef Tabenkin, the head of Yitzhak Tabenkin, the big leader of the kibbutz movement and one of the old Stalinists. And, I remember when I wrote about it in the past, I still had a chance to talk to Gandhi, Rechavam Ze'evi. He knew the unit from the start. He knew Avraham Arnan. He said, yes, there is a meaning to the fact that Arnan came from the 4th battalion. I also spoke with Dovik Tamari, who really brought the unit into its own. Before Dovik Tamari, it wasn't such a professional unit. And he himself said, yes, it was, we sort of adapted the external looks and the fighting spirit of the Tzanchanim, the paratroopers, but we tried to emulate the spirit of the Palmach, it was already during the state years. And definitely, it was Chaver Mevi Chaver. A friend brings a friend. Most of the unit, like everybody said in the past, there were people from the kibbutz. because there are maybe already objective reasons for, but the spirit remained for many years. Now it's different, but you can see that this was a machinery for creating leadership, elite leadership. 3 prime ministers came from the unit. You're talking about a few hundreds. There's no country where a small unit bring out from it 3 prime ministers, heads of the Mossad, chief of staff. It's not natural. Something is wrong there. In this kind of
maybe we should disperse a unit.
That's something different. The same with the Air Force. The Air Force for many years, up until I think maybe 82, it's 50% of the pilots, maybe even more, were also people who were born on the kibbutzniks. This is why when I spoke years ago with the mythological head of the Shin Bet, of the security service, years after he retired, Amos Manor. Mm-hmm. In the 50s, when he took over from Israel, they made huge efforts to woo the Americans, to prove to the Americans that we have great shushu services. Intelligence services. And you can see that we were something. And he said to me on the phone, I remember it, for some reason he was very frank. The Americans in the early 50s saw Israel, he said, as pink. Not red, but pink. And he mentioned also that they knew that if half the Air Force is from kibbutzim who are actually Stalinists, who knows what kind of stuff they have here.
Let me ask you a question, because we're...
but it's all changed, and did not change, because you see, the main leaders of those refuseniks are from the pilots.
So let me, and also from Sayed Makal, they had a letter. But I mean, I thought that it had reached a critical mass when the head of the Air Force fired the pilot who was the ringleader. But then he was reinstated the next day. And so I was feeling very optimistic going into Shabbat, because I thought, okay, the IDF is walking away from this. And then on Saturday night, when the Inspector General, gave this panic statement, it made me think, I don't know. And now in our conversation, I mean, is there nothing that these people will stop at? I mean, is there a way people are talking about, can we negotiate something? Who would we negotiate with? I mean, Lapid is a perfect politician for a judicial oligarchy because he has no brain, and he is absolutely just lighting more and more fire.
I don't see that there is a chance.
What's the end goal? Wait, let me just ask you, what is an end game for these? You told me what the end game for these people is, which is essentially just a takeover of Israel and transformation of this country into something post-Jewish and terribly horrible.
For them, there are just too many Jews in the Jewish state.
Right. So the question is, what is the government supposed to do? I mean, the government also is becoming a little bit shell-shocked by all of this. I don't think that they had thought that it would get like this.
Of course not. I think nobody envisioned such a situation. But I do think that still they have the legitimacy. They won a clear majority. Unfortunately for Judge Amit, they counted the votes. He shouldn't have counted them.
Right.
They counted the votes. And so there is a basic legitimacy, and I think that the court understands it. And so what they should do in order to prevail is first to hold their own, to wear them out, and to go with the mitveh, with the
compromise, with an offer of a compromise.
With Yariv Levin's plan, Not Simcha Rothman is bringing too many laws on board. It should be minimal by the plan of Yariv Levin. Things that can bring back the power to the Knesset.
Right.
The committee to choose, to nominate judges, the clause of reasonability, judicial, maybe another one or two items. But for instance, tomorrow, Ben Gvir wants to start legislating the chasinut for immunity for soldiers. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't, because the government should appear completely on the side of the rule of law. We only want to correct things, to fix things, to get democracy on track. But the government is not against the rule of law, and this kind of legislation is no good. It's something that hinders the real thing that the government wants to do.
It's a distraction.
It's not just a distraction. He broadcasts that maybe this government is not really adhering to the rule of law. What kind of a law is it that you give immunity to soldiers? You have to, there are various ways to handle violations by soldiers, but you shouldn't legislate a law that from the outset will give immunity to soldiers. It'll create maybe a wave of violence.
I don't know. I disagree with that, but I don't really think that that's the issue. I think that the issue really is, not standing down. I feel personally that, the thing that's missing most is Netanyahu's voice in this. I think that he should really deliver a speech reminding us of how we got here in the first place and of talking about where he wants to lead the country. I think that he can do that even though the Attorney General has tried to put a sock in his mouth by saying he's not allowed to talk about judicial reform. I feel like he's just missing. I feel like, we need to hear from him. We're being demoralized by her. We're being demoralized by the media.
You're right. I think, first of all, he has to galvanize the camp that supported the government.
Let's not forget that the demand for legal reform didn't come from the politicians. It came from the ground up. It's because you had Israeli community after community that has been directly harmed by the judiciary. It's everybody from the ranchers in the Negev to the residents of South Tel Aviv who have been overrun by illegal aliens. It's the settlers, it's the ultra-Orthodox, it's the Ethiopians. There's so many different sectors of Israeli society that one after the other felt the weight of the judicial oligarchy on their backs.
It's not only this, but we were talking about Gali Bar-Rav Miara,
the Attorney General.
The Attorney General, supposedly. She's not Attorney General. She should have prosecuted this guy from Sayeret Matkal, Ron Sharf, who vandalized Kohelet offices. This was a barbaric act. He should have been in jail now.
And he was released?
I think he was released, and I don't hear that anybody is going to charge him on this.
Yeah, no, the selective enforcement here is shocking.
This move against Kohelet with the attack, the physical attack on their offices, is one step short of burning books. You attack a think tank. Or the attack on Sarah Netanyahu.
Yeah.
And
nobody was arrested for that either.
There was another ugly event, which is not really a violation, but it was very ugly. People who served in the security services gathered near the house of Avi Dichter, pressuring him to get out of the government or move against this legislation. I mean, what kind of democracy brings these people who served the Israeli security? They have no ethos of liberalism and of democracy. I think it's very saddening to watch. I don't know. Do you remember this event with Carmi Gilon and the various thugs who gathered there?
It's amazing that these people that we upheld for generations and revered are trying to sink the entire country because
not all of them. It's not the best of them, but it's
many of them.
Many of them, yeah.
Look, I think that what we're seeing here is, I truly believe.
Kahalani is not one of them.
No, Kahalani isn't one of them. Even Shalom, even Mofaz was against them, and Gabi Ashkenazi. I mean, I think that the
losers are there. Chalutz.
Yeah, the ones who were the failed chiefs of staff of the IDF and the Mossad, and but it's amazing. Like you were talking about the kibbutzim and the bonds. I mean, it's the same thing with people who serve together in the military. I think that people have a hard time standing up to this mob.
How can adults come together like the old squad? One of the squads that their fighters were in Entebbe, right? Tzevet Amnon. They sent a special letter to Bibi and his brother Ido. When you read it, you realize immediately that they parrot slogans by a copywriter. Why people who are 70 or 71 years old would sign such a letter? It's such depravity. I mean, and they're real heroes. Amnon Peled from Magan Michael is the one who he decided the fight in Entebbe. He crashed first into the terminal, and killed the first terrorists. Why is it doing it?
It's very sad. Well, I truly believe that, the people of Israel are stronger than this. I think, we've stood up to worse intimidation from them. And I think that if Netanyahu is, and I think he will, he will stand the test of leadership, and we'll get through this. I mean, we are in the middle of a full-blown social crisis and constitutional crisis. But I think that it took so long for us to get 64, to get over that hump of 61. We got it on this agenda, and I don't think that there's any going back. If, Netanyahu knows that time is of the essence, we have to take care of Iran's nuclear installations. But I don't believe that if you stand down on this, you can do that. I think that everything is contingent, because if he stands down on this, then
he won't have a government.
He won't have a government anymore to take on Iran. And it's very distressing. All right, well, Amnon, I think we're going to have to leave it there. And,
I hope we haven't saddened the people who watch this.
No, I think that you guys understand that, things go up and things go down, but our wheel is spinning in our direction. And we won these elections. And the people who voted in the elections on November 1st were a much more powerful demonstration of democracy than any number of people that you can get to meet in a square at any time. I mean, the real democracy is at the ballot, and not even in the TV studios. And we knew what we were doing when we went and we voted. Nobody was deluding themselves to thinking that it was going to be easy, but I don't think we thought that it was going to be this ugly. But okay, it's this ugly, and we'll just muddle through. It'll be done. It has to be. We don't have any choice. I thank you very much, Amnon, for coming, and I thank you guys for watching. And
thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. And I'm sure you'll be waiting with bated breath, as we all are, to see, how this shakes out. God willing, it'll be fine.